You're listening to
DNA ID.
brought to you by AbJack Entertainment. Be sure to check out some of the other great true crime podcasts from this network, including The Murder in My Family, Missing Persons, Scene of the Crime,
Zodiac Speaking.
Beyond Bizarre True Crime,
Citizen Detective, and
Campus Killings.
all of these podcasts are available for you to binge on right now, wherever you listen to podcasts. Subscribe where you're listening to this podcast so you don't miss an episode.
In this episode, I'll be focusing on the resolution of Michella Welch's case. Her initial disappearance and the finding of Michella's brutalized body was covered quite extensively in the Jennifer Bastian episode, so if you haven't listened to that one, please go back and do so. You'll recall Michella was in Puget Park, a small park adjacent to a half-mile-long wooded area ending in a gulch, and she was with her sisters on March 26, 1986. Michella biked home to pick up lunch, sliced up some oranges, grabbed some Easter candy, and brought the food back for her sisters. But when Angela and Nicole came back from a trip to a nearby commercial establishment to use the restroom, the food and Michella's bike were there, but Michella was not. A teacher at her school saw her talking to a man who was pointing in the direction of the gulch. And that's where Michella was found later that night. She'd been raped, her throat slit, and her head caved in by a hard object. On the night Michella was killed and then found by search dogs, police had to tell Barbara Welch the horrific news. She told Dateline, quote, "I was in one of the police cars and they told me they'd found her body. And, you know, when they say they found a body, it's not a person. It's terrible." Barbara went into shock and had to be transported to the hospital. She later published a brief thank you to the local community for the cards, gifts, and support extended to the family. At Michella's funeral, her gentle, artistic nature was eulogized by a reading of one of her own poems. It read, quote, "Deep, deep down in the beautiful forest, in the early greening spring, there is the most beautiful thing you ever saw on earth. It is a golden pond. At the golden pond, the little prince child comes to watch and to forget what he has done wrong. So, if you are true in your heart and can love at sunset, you are the one to see this shimmering golden pond." A recording of Michella playing the piano was also played. There wasn't a dry eye in the house, according to contemporary reporting. Police went after Michella's killer with everything they had. They pored over all her personal items, drawings, writings, and notes to see if she mentioned anyone suspicious. They talked to her neighbors, teachers at her school, music instructors. Within a few weeks of investigating, they decided her killing must have been random. But who, how, why? They speculated about whether Michella had decided to leave the lunches on the picnic table and go to the gulch area to try to find her sisters. That's where she met her fate. Or possibly, the man talking to her might have lured her there. He might have said, "Your sisters are in the gulch, I can lead you to them." Or even, "One of them got hurt, let me take you to her." Michella was well known for her nurturing nature toward her sisters, and she was also trusting, and as one friend of the family said, not street smart at all. Her mother later said, quote, "When an innocent child is tricked, such as Michella was, into believing someone is trying to help them, and is led away and killed because of their innocence, then there is going to be a hell of a debt to pay." Barbara was referring to a debt in the eternal sense, of course, but hope remained that the killer would be caught and have to pay for what he did in real life as well. It remains unclear to this day what exactly happened to Michella and where she encountered her killer. A case summary prepared by the Tacoma PD says, quote, "The most probable scenario is that Michella returned to the park and did not see her sisters. She locked her bicycle up, as that was where it was later found. She sat at a picnic table and began to eat her lunch, as evidenced by the partially consumed sandwich left behind. She either went into the Gulch area in search of her sisters and was confronted by the suspect, or was lured into the Gulch by the suspect in hopes of locating her sisters. We believe the more likely scenario is that she went into the Gulch area on her own and was contacted by the suspect there. The suspect was able to somehow lead the victim to the isolated area or control the victim and escort her to the isolated area where the sexual assault occurred." End quote. The traumatized Tacoma community panicked that Michella's killer would kill another child, established a reward of $5,000 for information leading to the apprehension of her killer. Of course, as we know, that didn't result in Michella's murderer being caught, and it didn't stop Jenny Bastian from being killed 4 months later, solidifying the fears that there was a child killer on the loose. A year after Michella's murder, Barbara Welch told the Tacoma News-Tribune, quote, "I'd like to have seen the person responsible caught, tried, and convicted already. As it is now, the person is still at large. The person is still an unknown, and that is scary." Indeed it was, and it remained so. As we heard, Michella's case was one of the reasons the Tacoma PD started its cold case homicide unit in 2009. Over the years after her killer's DNA profile was extracted in 2006, investigators in Michella's case went on to eliminate 108 suspects using direct DNA comparisons. More were excluded in the 2016 to 2017 DNA elimination campaign in the wake of the release of the Parabon snapshot phenotypes, the one where Robert Washburn was nailed for killing Jenny Bastian. But by the late 20-teens in Michella's case, it was time to call on scientific developments to give law enforcement the lead they needed. You'll recall that Detective Lindsay Wade had requested the assistance of Dr. Barbara Ray Venter on both Jenny and Michella's unsolved cases. On August 8, 2017, Detective Wade mailed Dr. Ray Venter DNA extracts derived from the semen left on and inside Michella. SNP profiles were prepared, and Dr. Ray Venter uploaded the profiles to Family Tree DNA and GEDmatch. On October 24, 2017, she informed Detective Wade that she had identified 2 individuals, Clyde S. and Stanley M., who were approximately second cousins, possibly first cousins once removed, of the unknown suspect. Further, recent generations of Clyde's tree were located in Washington. There were 2 more distant cousins named Christy, who had 114 centimorgans, and Ryan, who had 64 centimorgans, in the databases, who were related to the top match, Clyde. But the documented information on these folks did not match up with the level of shared DNA the genealogist was seeing. Dr. Ray Venter requested that Parabon Nanolabs, which had already done the snapshot phenotype in Michella's case, be called in to assist in the genealogy. In May of 2018, Tacoma Police Detective Steve Riopel gave approval to Parabon to proceed with the genealogy analysis. It didn't take long for C.C. Moore, Parabon's chief genetic genealogist, to come up with a hypothesis. The company issued a report of its findings and recommendations on May 28, 2018. C.C. uploaded the suspect's raw DNA data file to GEDmatch. The results confirmed what Dr. Ray Venter had found. The top match was Clyde S., who shared 404 centimorgans with the suspect. His public family tree was located on Ancestry.com, and Clyde's mother's raw DNA data file had also been uploaded to GEDmatch. The lack of shared DNA between Clyde's mother and the suspect, but the confirmed parent-child relationship between Clyde and his mother, meant that the suspect was related to Clyde on Clyde's father's side. The second closest DNA relative in the database was Stanley M., who shared 195 centimorgans of DNA with the suspect. His public family tree was found on Ancestry.com as well. Stanley's daughter-in-law, Janice M., handled Stanley's tree and GEDmatch account, and she agreed to provide information about his extended cousins. But even more importantly, Cece could see that Stanley M. and Clyde S. had no shared DNA in common, and therefore were not directly related to each other, meaning that they were related to the suspect on 2 different branches of the suspect's family tree. Quote, "The suspect must therefore descend from common ancestors present in each of their respective family trees." Additional DNA relatives of the suspect in GEDmatch shared 41 centimorgans, 88 centimorgans, and 63 centimorgans with him. These additional partial matches allowed Cece to build out the family trees for both of Stanley and Clyde and try to determine where their trees intersected, knowing that the suspect must come from that branch. But she couldn't find any intersection, and this typically meant that the connection likely occurred through a misattributed paternity event. Even though she couldn't find a most recent common ancestor, Cece could see through these built-out family trees that Clyde S. had two first cousins that were interesting, brothers with the surname Hartman, who both had ties to Tacoma, Washington. These were Gary Charles Hartman, born December 16, 1951 in Humboldt, California, and his brother RJ, 6 years younger and also born in Humboldt, California. Their father was Charles Hartman Jr., and their mother Donna Snyder Hartman of Tacoma, Washington. Quote, Clyde's father, Charles Leslie S., is listed as the full sibling of Gary and Charles's mother, Donna. A full family tree was constructed for Gary and RJ, and it was determined that on their father's mother's side they have 2 second great-grandmothers of full Native American ancestry, which is consistent with the amount of Native American ancestry predicted for the suspect by Parabon snapshot DNA phenotype analysis. Remember that the admixture reflected by the suspect's genetic makeup indicated that he was about 9% Native American heritage. Well, Gary and RJ both lived in the vicinity of Tacoma's Puget Park in 1986, and they were both of age to be Michella's killer that year. So Gary and RJ were looking pretty interesting. But Cece still had questions about how second top match Stanley fit in. Stanley's whole family lived in Michigan, and he had no known relatives in Washington where Michella was killed. A quote from Cece's report, Gary and RJ Hartman warrant further investigation under the hypothesis that the family connection occurred through misattributed paternity. Cece arrived at this conclusion after fleshing out the family trees for all these people and observing that the level of DNA they shared, according to GEDmatch, did not line up with the documented family tree information. The family tree on the Hartman brothers' mother's side, where Clyde S. was located, pointed to him being a first cousin. However, the amount of DNA he shared with the brothers was not consistent with the level expected to be shared by first cousins. It was actually less. So Cece figured out the puzzle presented to her. Her report says, quote, our working hypothesis is that Gary and RJ's mother, Donna S., unknowingly had a different biological father than Clyde's father, Charles Leslie S., making Donna and Charles half-siblings instead of full siblings. According to public family trees, both are the children of Charles H. S. and Zola Ellen Cook S. However, based on genetic and circumstantial evidence, Parabon believes that Stanley M.'s half-uncle, Raymond John M., may actually be Donna S.'s biological father, instead of her mother's husband, Charles. Raymond M. was living in the same town as Donna's parents in Centralia, Washington, when she was conceived in 1933. He is the only male from Stanley M.'s tree known to have ever lived close enough to the S family to enable an intersection between them. So Raymond M. was the missing link. He only lived in Washington state for a short time, and the rest of his family was in Michigan. If he was Donna's biological father, then that provided the triangulation between the two branches of the suspect's family tree. More from the report, quote, if this hypothesis is correct, then the top match, Clyde S., would be Gary and RJ Hartman's half-first cousin, which is consistent with the amount of shared DNA between Clyde and the subject. This would also mean that Stanley M. would be half-first cousins once removed with Gary and RJ Hartman, which is consistent with the amount of DNA shared between Stanley and the subject, end quote. Cece couldn't find a lot of information on brothers Gary and RJ Hartman, other than that they both lived in the north end of Tacoma at the time Michella was killed and had some addresses that aligned with Puget Park and Michella's home. She said that when she delivered her report on May 28, 2018, the Tacoma investigators were skeptical. It was the early days of IGG. The Golden State Killer had been identified just a month earlier, and neither Hartman brother was in the case file. Nonetheless, the investigators proceeded to follow up on Parabon's recommendations to obtain surreptitious DNA from the Hartman brothers to compare to the DNA in Michella's case. There was good reason to suspect that of the two brothers, R.J. Hartman was the killer. His wife had filed for divorce alleging domestic abuse and had obtained a restraining order against him back in 1993. They had ended up remarrying and were still together, but still, R.J. seemed like a good place to start, since Gary had no record whatsoever that police could find. Further, of the two, RJ was the one who had dropped out of high school, whereas his brother had graduated. On June 2, 2018, Detective Buchanan of the Tacoma Police was following RJ Hartman at Middle Fork State Park. He collected a crushed Coke can that RJ discarded. On June 8, 2018, detectives followed RJ as he went to dinner with his family at Puerto Vallarta restaurant in Graham. They watched him eating his meal and drinking 3 cocktails through those tiny cocktail straws that were in each glass. As soon as the glasses were cleared by the waitstaff, the detectives snagged the straws, as well as a water glass RJ had used. The items were sent to the Washington Crime Lab for DNA analysis. The mixed DNA profile obtained from the crushed Coke can was consistent with at least 5 contributors, so the can was deemed not valuable for DNA analysis. From the drinking straws, however, the crime lab determined, quote, the major male contributor profile is excluded as the source of the profile obtained previously from the rectal swab's sperm fraction derived from Michella Welch's autopsy swabs, end quote. It was time to turn to Gary. At 7:30 on the morning of June 5, 2018, Gary Hartman drove his turquoise Chevy pickup to his job at Western State Hospital. He parked and went inside and soon came out and got in a work vehicle with a female coworker I'm not naming. They drove to the McDonald's on Stella Coon Boulevard in Lakewood. Tacoma Police Detectives Larson, Buchanan, Shank, Malave, and Riopel followed Hartman, and Detectives Riopel and Malave went into the McDonald's and enjoyed McBreakfast sandwiches while they watched Hartman order a coffee and breakfast. He drank the coffee from his own mug, which he had brought with him, which detectives would find out later may have been because of paranoia. Detective Riopel sat at a table 10 feet away from Hartman. Quote, I observed Hartman wipe his mouth several times with the brown paper napkin while eating his breakfast sandwich. After he was done eating, he crumpled up the napkin and placed it into a McDonald's bag along with his receipt and sandwich wrapper. He then crumpled up the McDonald's bag and set it to the side out of his way while he continued drinking coffee and talking, end quote. Detective Riopel stepped aside and talked to a McDonald's employee who was sweeping up. He identified himself as a police officer and asked her if she would be willing to collect the bag for evidence. She agreed, so the detective told her to ask Hartman if he was done with the bag and if he wanted her to get rid of it for him. She did, and Hartman waved at the bag indicating, take it. So the employee collected it and surreptitiously brought the bag over to Detective Riopel. He handed it to Detective Malave, who concealed it in his jacket and left the store with it. On June 7th, they submitted the napkin Hartman had used to the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab for DNA analysis. The police received the report from the WSP Crime Lab on June 19th. Quote, the mixed DNA profile from the napkin is consistent with a major male contributor and a trace component. The male contributor profile matches the profile obtained previously from the sperm fraction of the rectal swabs of Michella Welch. The estimated probability of selecting an unrelated individual at random from the U.S. population with a matching profile is 1 in 6 quadrillion. It was Gary Hartman who had killed 12-year-old Michella way back in 1986. Police arrested Hartman on June 20th. They staked out his Lakewood home at 5:30 in the morning and followed him as he left the house alone in his silver SUV at 10:30. His adult daughter, whose first initial is K, was following him in a separate car. The officers pulled up next to and in front of Hartman as he was stopped at a stop sign at the intersection of Mount Tacoma Drive Southwest and Meadow Road Southwest. Gang Unit Supervisor David Johnson walked up to the car and Hartman rolled down the window. Johnson said, "You're under arrest. Turn off the car and step out." Hartman complied and Johnson put him in cuffs. Hartman said, "What am I being arrested for?" Johnson told him detectives would update him. Then Hartman complained about shoulder pain from the cuffs, so he was placed in a different pair and put into a squad car. Later that day, Hartman was charged with the first-degree murder and rape of Michella Welch. Detective Riopel delivered the news to Barbara Welch. She said she got shivers up her spine. Her daughter Nicole, who was only 9 at the time her sister was slain, said to King 5, quote, "You would think 32 years later you'd be okay. But it's not. It's still real all the time. It's really sad to think he's been out there living a free life when he cut my sister's life short." In a press conference called with regard to the 3-decade-old Michella Welch case, Tacoma Police Chief Don Ramsdell, who was a rookie Tacoma police officer at the time of Michella's slaying, announced that they had arrested a suspect in her murder. His name was Gary Charles Hartman. Chief Ramsdell said, quote, "If you think you can run, you're wrong. If you think you can hide, you're wrong. The cold case department will never give up." "If you're a criminal who left DNA at a crime scene, you might as well turn yourself in now. We will catch you," said Pierce County Prosecutor Mark Lindquist. While Hartman was being driven to the police station, officers accompanied his daughter back to her home, where her mother, Hartman's wife, was standing outside the olive green house talking to Tacoma police who were executing a search warrant. The Hartford women both agreed to be driven to the TPD for interviews. Meanwhile, police tore up the house apart, looking for anything incriminating. This was not an easy task. The front yard of the house was overgrown with 6-foot-tall weeds. Tacoma detectives' notes read, quote, "The condition of the interior of the house was a near hoarder house due to the amount of junk inside. Some rooms were stacked near floor to ceiling with boxes of junk. Thick layers of dust covered much of the furniture. There was a small Chihuahua-type dog kept inside with dog feces in the kitchen, with another full-size boxer-type dog kept in a small kennel in the backyard. The dog outside did not appear to be cared for." End quote. Imagine the search team having to go through all that stuff. One of the things they were looking for was Michella's pink glasses, which were never found. But somehow, amidst the clutter, the police managed to find multiple folding knives, 2 handguns, a ton of ammo, and a whole lot of electronic devices. They also searched Hartman's office at Western State Hospital, but found nothing of interest there. Once Hartman was at the Tacoma PD headquarters, before he was booked, detectives placed him into an interview room. He immediately asked for his medication, half a Xanax. He said he took them for panic attacks. He then proceeded to have a panic attack, so they waited as his medication kicked in. Then the interview began. Detective Riopel obtained some basic biographical info and then read Hartman his rights. The detective asked if he was willing to voluntarily answer questions now that he acknowledged he understood his rights. And Hartman said, "I don't know, this is really scary." He said he thought he needed somebody by his side because he was paranoid and didn't trust a lot of people. He said, quote, "I don't have any hardly close friends at all because I don't trust people very much," end quote. They talked a little longer, and Hartman seemed to take the bait when Detective Riopel suggested that he seemed like he'd straightened his life out and changed for the better since the 1980s. Hartman said, quote, "I'm not the same person I was. From not carrying a gun anymore, to not hanging around with criminals, to not using drugs. That's why I adopted these kids. I didn't want any of my blood being produced. I just figured the DNA, Jesus Christ, just like Neanderthal hillbillies," end quote. Riopel said, "Well, like I said, Gary, I've been doing this for a while, and this whole thing seems out of character for you. And so you've tried to move on and do the best you can in life, tried to make amends. Like you said, you've changed things around, been faithful to your wife, raised your kids the best you could. They seem to be productive, good people to me." Hartman, "They are." Riopel, "So I think you've done well in that arena, but we all have things in our past. We all make mistakes when we're young, and that happens. And so we can't go back and we can't undo things, but we can start to make it right at some point. And I think that's important. It's important to make amends. It's important to start to right the ship. You have to an extent, but it's also important to just kind of continue that path." Hartman hemmed and hawed about what to do for more than 15 pages of back and forth dialogue. He couldn't decide whether he wanted to demand an attorney. It seems that doing so would make the whole thing seem all too real to him. "I'm scared to death right now," he said. He was very concerned about his family seeing him facing a judge. He was also fixated on the ins and outs of jail and asked a ton of procedural questions. He was really worked up about having to share a cell and asked how often people get hung down there. Finally, Hartman said, "I just want to try to get the fairest shake possible, and to do that, I think I need an attorney." Riopel, "Okay, if that's what you want, I understand that. Like I told you, that's your decision. It's your decision. If that's the way you want to go." Hartman, "And you guys can't tell me anything more." Riopel, "I can tell you what you're being charged for." Hartman, "Okay." Riopel, "But I think you already know." Hartman, "It could be several things." Riopel, "Okay." Hartman, Riopel, "This is regarding the murder of Michella Welch." Hartman, "Oh my God, murder. So I got to get an attorney. Jesus Christ, Jesus. Phew, this is way worse than I expected. So right now you guys are thinking you want to see me die." Riopelle assured him that they did not, but said, quote, "You are under arrest and are going to be booked on Murder 1 for the murder of Michella Welch. Your DNA was a match to DNA at the crime scene. We have a warrant to collect a buccal swab from you." Well, the buccal swab was collected, and then Hartman was taken to the Pierce County Jail and booked. When the crime lab reports came back, they confirmed that Hartman was the man who had left his semen on Michella. The mitochondrial DNA found in the pubic hairs found at Michella's crime scene was also found to be concordant with Hartman's DNA from his buccal swab, meaning he could not be excluded as the source of the hairs. In recorded jailhouse phone calls with his wife, Hartman said, "My past is my past, and I'm incredibly sorry, and I love you all." Okay, so what do we know about Hartman? Not really very much. As we heard in the genealogy section, Gary Charles Hartman was born on December 16, 1951, in Humboldt, California, to parents Charles Hartman Jr. and Donna Snyder Hartman. Hartman has a brother, RJ, and a sister I'm calling by her first initials, C. The family relocated to Tacoma, Washington, where Donna was from. Hartman attended Lincoln High School in Tacoma and graduated in 1970. He was on the wrestling team in high school. After that, he left his mother's house, not getting along with his stepdad. It also sounds like the household was very dysfunctional, with both Hartman and his brother RJ alleging they suffered and engaged in various abusive behaviors. In early 1971, Hartman joined the Naval Reserves to avoid the draft. After that, he seems to have had a number of jobs working for Safeway, Hostess, and Coca-Cola as a truck driver. Then he became a mental health technician. His family said he was a functioning alcoholic, but according to his attorney, Hartman got sober in 1989 when he was 38 and went to school to obtain his nursing degree in 1992. Hartman got a job as an RN with the State Department of Social and Health Services in October 98, and after that, worked at Western State Hospital. He was still working there when he was arrested. Hartman was married 4 times to 3 different women. He married a woman named Patty on June 11, 1971, when he was just 19. They had met in 7th grade homeroom. They divorced on May 7, 73. He married Patty again on November 8, 1974, and they divorced again on May 25, 1976. They shared a daughter, but Hartman had no contact with her after the couple split because he drank too much and was unfaithful numerous times, according to Patty. He was single for a time and then married a woman named Elizabeth on August 22, 1981. They divorced as well, but not until June 5, 1989, although Hartman had left the home in 1988 because Elizabeth kicked him out after he admitted cheating. Note that this means he was married to Elizabeth when he killed Michella. After Elizabeth, he married a woman whose initials are LF on July 3, 1996, and they were still married when Hartman was arrested. LF was an accountant who had gotten a graduate degree in psychology and was now a practitioner. She and Hartman have 2 adopted adult daughters. Because Hartman lawyered up and wouldn't talk, police set about gathering information about him in preparation for trial by interviewing those who knew him best, his family and colleagues. Detective Riopelle and Detective Ryan Larson interviewed RJ, Hartman's brother. There was a bit of chit-chat about football, and then Detective Riopelle asked about RJ and his brother Gary's childhood. RJ said, quote, "It was all good until I was like 9. Dad would be good, he was an alcoholic, but he never hurt anybody. He'd go for dry periods at a time," end quote. But RJ said his mom drank too, and, quote, "About 3 to 4 days a week their dinner would be up against the wall." Riopelle asked, "She'd get upset and throw things?" RJ, "Oh, yeah, and then she'd shoot him with BB guns and hit him with frying pans and yeah." Riopelle, "Okay." RJ said, "I'd just go hide in the bedroom. Yeah, it was like 3 to 4 days a week when I was 9 years old, and she was always pissed at me because I always stuck up for my dad. My brother never did. He hated him, and I never knew why. He just hated him." RJ went on to reveal that his and Gary's mother had sexually abused him, starting when he was 9 and his father left the home. He said she'd fondled his genitals until at age 12 he was old enough to stop her. Gary, his 6 years older brother, had tied RJ up in the garage when he was supposed to be babysitting him so he could go out with his friends. He also beat his younger brother with a rubber hose and hit him with a baseball bat on numerous occasions. He also choked him into unconsciousness one time, RJ maintained. RJ said his brother Gary hated women. It probably started with their mother, whom Hartman believed was, quote, whoring around after their father left, but It extended to all women, RJ said. He said that when his mother's female friends would pass out, Hartman would rape them. This was when he was still a young man living at home. When he was older, he frequented prostitutes regularly. RJ also reported that when he was young, 3rd or 4th grade, his brother, who, remember, was 6 years older than he, anally raped him. He became emotional when discussing this and said his brother just couldn't slow the mean. Hartman also tortured and killed animals. He killed the neighbor's cat, doused it in gasoline, and set it on fire. He went on to hang, kill, and dissect other animals, including a dog and a porcupine he'd found. When he was older, according to RJ, Hartman was always getting into fights, beating people up, and he wasn't afraid of anything. There was some indication that Hartman always had a penchant for little girls. According to RJ, when RJ's daughter was very small, like 8 years old, his brother Gary commented on how nice her ass was getting. RJ said Hartman always liked young girls and would try to be around them. RJ's wife Barbara backed this up, saying she would not let their girls be around Uncle Gary. She had a creep radar, she said, and it was triggered by him. One time at his brother's house, RJ said he found a bag in the garage containing women's underwear and leather leg restraints. Hartman bragged to his brother that working at the hospital, he had access to liquid Valium. And he said he wanted to be a nurse in the first place because you can see naked people at the hospital. The gowns all open in the back, he pointed out. RJ said that in the 80s, the time period in which Michella was murdered, his brother changed his appearance all the time, sometimes with longer hair, sometimes shorter hair, sometimes a mustache, sideburns, no sideburns, and so on. I have to admit my eyes bugged out of my head when I read that RJ told the detectives that his daughter knew Jenny Bastian from Downing Elementary and had ridden bikes with her around the school a couple of times. So Gary Hartman's niece was friends with Jenny Bastian, who would soon be killed by another child killer, Robert Washburn. Detectives also spoke at length with Barbara, RJ's wife. She said she didn't like Gary and he was always inciting trouble. Every time he came over, her underwear would go missing from the laundry basket. Detective Buchanan asked her, "When in '86 all this came out, did Gary ever mention the news of either one of these girls?" Barbara said, "Yeah, he talked about the girl and the Point Defiance Park." Larson, "Gary did?" Barbara, "Yeah." Detective Buchanan asked, "He talked about Bastian, but did he ever talk about Welch?" Barbara, No, he would say he knew things because he knew a detective that was working on the case and he would tell him stuff, which just didn't sound right to me." Barbara said when she and Randy helped Hartman move once, they noted how many books he had about serial killers. She also noted that he seemed unduly interested in the Green River Killer's success and remarked about how smart he must be to keep getting away with it. Barbara also said when Hartman drank, quote, he would get extremely mean. Detective Larson asked Barbara what her reaction was when she heard that Hartman had been arrested. Barbara, "My reaction? Just like it figures." Larson, "Were you not surprised?" Barbara, "Not surprised. I always told my husband I thought he would get caught doing something bad eventually and probably hurting a young girl." Hartman's two-time ex-wife, Patty, the one who had met him in 7th grade, said of young Hartman, "He was really nice. He only slapped me once." She said their sex life was totally normal, no fetishes, role-playing, or anything kinky. For Patty, Hartman was inextricably part of her life just due to their shared history. She told the detectives, quote, "I still find it hard to believe he could have done this. I really do. I'm still really numb, to tell you the honest-to-God's truth. I just cannot visualize him doing that. It's like Ted Bundy, you just never know. But I grew up with the kid, 12 years old. We were 12 years old. I knew him since then. And, I just hope to God that's the only one he ever did. I hate the thought that he did that, but I hope he didn't hurt anyone else. And I just wish it wouldn't have taken so long." Well, we all do. Next, detectives interviewed Elizabeth, the woman Hartman was married to at the time Michella was killed. She gave them a lot of basic background information on him and said she was very surprised to read in the media that police had not located a criminal history for Hartman because she knew, for a fact, he had been arrested during their marriage. It turned out he had been arrested for exposure, technically public indecency, for flashing a young girl at a Sears store in Renton, Washington. He had called Elizabeth from jail and told her that under the floorboard of his van was a stack of $100 bills she should use to bail him out. Detective Larson verified this arrest, which took place on May 5, 1987. A year after he killed Michella Welch, Hartman downgraded to exposure and got caught. For some reason, he wasn't convicted of this crime, and it didn't appear on his record, but he was ordered to see a psychiatrist. Elizabeth said Hartman told her he'd been let go from his job as a Coca-Cola delivery driver because of lewd behavior. It's unclear whether this was the same incident or something else. Hartman blamed his behavior on being molested as a kid by a relative, supposedly an uncle, although he told others it was a cousin. Elizabeth said she was freaked out one time when she found a pair of her cut-off shorts in a closet in the house they shared on Huson Street. The shorts had been slit with a knife right up the crotch. She confronted Hartman with those shorts, and he got very defensive. And then there was this. Elizabeth said, quote, I distinctly remember him saying that he had to change his facial appearance because he looked like a drawing that was being put on the TV. And I don't know which of these it related to. She means between Jenny or Michella. But it had to have been one of them. I don't remember if it was growing a mustache, shaving a mustache. I don't know if he had hair that he cut, but I really remember him saying that he had to change his appearance because, oh, I look like that man. Elizabeth also told the story of Hartman killing her dog. Larson, what kind of dog did you have? Elizabeth, a Dachshund. I fell in love with Dachshunds. That was my wedding gift from him. Larson, okay. Elizabeth, and that's the meanest thing. It was when we were on Washington Street. I came home one day, and he'd called me at work, and he said, when you get home, you will find Toby upstairs in a box. Sure enough, when she got home, her dog was dead in a cardboard box. Hartman said he'd been bad, so he'd kicked him. Elizabeth said, I just recall my own opinion of Gary always being that because he was small in stature, he made up for it by thinking he was a badass. At the end of their marriage, Hartman, age 38, moved in with a 19-year-old former patient he'd met at Western State Hospital, Elizabeth told the detectives. Detective Quillo, the same one who was involved in the takedown of Robert Washburn, interviewed Hartman's current wife, whom I'm calling by her initials LF, after her husband's arrest. She hadn't been permitted to see him yet, and LF expressed shock and skepticism when Detective Quillo told her DNA proved her husband had raped and murdered a 12-year-old girl in 1986. LF admitted she didn't know a lot about her husband's past. He didn't like to talk about his childhood or his history. But she saw no signs, no weird sexual hang-ups, no kink, certainly no child fetishes. As a practicing psychologist, LF said she was aware of all the signs of abuse, and she didn't see any in the adopted daughters she shared with Hartman. She knew about abuse he'd experienced in his childhood, but said he was an exemplary father. I will say here that both of Hartman's daughters were adopted from other countries and looked nothing like blonde-haired Michella Welch. Whatever the reason, Hartman doesn't appear to have victimized them. LF described Hartman as very personable. His hobby was antique cars. They liked to go to car shows together. LF said to Detective Quillo, I want more information about this evidence. I still don't believe this. Quillo, okay. LF, I think it's a mistake. I don't see that it's possible. Quillo, his DNA was a match to the semen found inside the girl's vagina. LF, I don't believe it. Okay, let's talk about the legal stuff. Barbara Welch flew back to Tacoma from Nashville, where she now lived, to attend Hartman's June 25th arraignment. For 32 years, he's gotten away with it, she said to KOMO News outside her hotel. I'm here because I believe in justice. He owes not only myself, but my family, the community. He owes everyone a huge apology. But even apologizing can't bring her back, she concluded. At the arraignment, Hartman pleaded not guilty to the charges. The prosecutors told the court Hartman had significant assets and was a flight risk, and requested that bail be set at $5 million. Superior Court Commissioner Megan Foley agreed to this hefty number, which was intended to ensure that Hartman stayed locked up pending trial. Hartman's attorney, Brian Hirschman, mounted a vigorous defense of his client. Quote, Gary Hartman is facing the most awful of allegations. It is very easy to presume someone guilty based solely on these charges. At all times, he has maintained his innocence, Hirschman told NBC News. He continued, the defense is pursuing various investigative leads. There are profound challenges in starting an investigation 32 years after a tragedy occurs. Mr. Hartman has lived an honorable life. For decades, he has been a licensed, registered nurse in Washington State. He held a very important job at Western State Hospital. He is a family man. In view of the horrific nature of these allegations, Mr. Hartman's cry of innocence, and the very profound challenges in investigating a 3-decade-old killing, I ask the public accord Mr. Hartman the presumption of innocence to which he is entitled. let the judicial system decide this case. So Hartman was going to fight the charges. Unlike Jennifer Bastian's killer, he wasn't going to plead guilty and fess up to the horrific crime he had perpetrated. As the judicial process marched toward trial, Hartman's attorney filed a motion to suppress the genealogy identification of Hartman, saying it was not his client's DNA in the database that identified him, but a relative's. Tacoma police, acting without a warrant, quote, unreasonably intruded into Mr. Hartman's private medical and familial affairs without authority of law, end quote. The motion claimed that Hartman had standing to challenge the use of his relative's DNA to identify him because he was the target of the search. Which is impossible, as of course the whole problem was the investigators had no target. They just had a bunch of numbers representing his SNPs. And when they did narrow down the investigation based on the genealogy, they didn't know whether they were looking for him or his brother. Hartman also maintained that the identification was an illegal search and seizure because Parabon was acting in its capacity as a state actor rather than a private party. And finally, the defense maintained that Hartman's right to privacy was violated by Parabon learning that his documented grandfather was in actuality not a blood relative, the whole misattributed parentage event at the grandparent level. The upshot was that the defense claimed the analysis conducted by Parabon and Dr. Ray Venter was unconstitutional, and that the DNA on the napkin linking Hartman to the crime should be excluded, and therefore the identification of Hartman and the buccal swab all had to be excluded as fruit of the poisonous tree. We've heard this type of defense in many of these cases before, right? But remember, this was fairly early days in the adjudication of genealogy identification cases, and it was a case of first impression in Washington. So on February 9, 2022, the state filed a lengthy response brief arguing against the motion to suppress, citing case law from other jurisdictions and the Supreme Court. They made all the arguments we would anticipate, essentially that Hartman did not have a privacy right in his relatives' DNA profiles that they voluntarily uploaded to a public database, and therefore he had no standing to vicariously assert his relatives' privacy rights under the Fourth Amendment. The judge agreed and denied the defense motion. The DNA evidence tying defendant Hartman to the rape and murder of Michella Welch would be admissible at trial. However, it is worth noting that the trial judge did agree with one of the Hartman's assertions that Dr. Ray Venter and Parabon were state actors. In other words, since they were acting at the behest of law enforcement, their searches of GEDmatch were considered government action, which were subject to, quote, search and seizure restrictions, and the restrictions on invasion of an individual's justifiable, reasonable, and legitimate expectations of privacy, end quote. But since Hartman didn't have an expectation of privacy in his relatives' public DNA profiles, there was no illegal search and seizure. After that, Hartman threw in the towel. We haven't seen this before, but Hartman waived his right to a jury trial, opting for a bench trial instead. In a bench trial, there is no jury. The judge is the trier of fact. Defendants don't usually go this route because they're much more likely to persuade one of 12 civilian jurors that reasonable doubt exists than one jaded judge. But Hartman did this deliberately. He was, in essence, waiving a trial and acquiescing to being adjudicated guilty without pleading guilty. Quote, I believe the defendant has done everything he can to almost plead guilty, Wagner, the prosecutor, said in court. Given the defendant's age, we believe that this is the best resolution. The defense attorney Hirschman and prosecutors agreed to certain facts surrounding Michella's death that Hartman would stipulate to. What this meant was that no witnesses had to be presented to prove these facts. They were to be accepted by the judge as proven beyond a reasonable doubt. The stipulated facts included that the DNA collected from Hartman's used napkin matched DNA from the semen collected from Michella's body. He also stipulated that his buccal swab DNA sample collected pursuant to a warrant matched the semen from the crime scene. He agreed that the estimated probability of selecting an unrelated individual at random from the U.S. population with a matching profile was calculated at 1 in 6 quadrillion. In other words, he didn't contest that the semen found on Michella was his and his alone. The agreed-upon facts didn't say outright that he killed Michella, but the stipulation expressly stated, the defendant understands that this court will review the facts and will determine the defendant's guilt on the charge of murder in the first degree from the stipulated facts. Further, as part of the agreement, Hartman waived his right to appeal, with the exception that he would still be able to pursue a challenge to the court's ruling denying his motion to suppress the DNA evidence. In other words, he was still going to fight the DNA identification after he was convicted. Given these facts, Pierce County Superior Court Judge Stanley Rumbaugh found Hartman guilty of first-degree murder on May 13, 2022. In consideration of the stipulation, the first-degree rape charge was dropped. The court's conclusions of law stated that all elements of the crime of murder in the first degree had been proven, and Gary Charles Hartman was guilty beyond a reasonable doubt of the crime of murder in the first degree that occurred on March 26, 1986, in that he committed or attempted to commit the crime of rape in the first degree, and in the course of or furtherance of such crime, the defendant caused the death of Michella Welch. The stipulation also provided for a sentencing recommendation of 320 months in prison. When it was time for Judge Rumbaugh to pronounce sentence, Hartman's defense attorney tried to claim mitigating circumstances. I'm not sure why he did this, since the sentence was already agreed to. Perhaps Hartman wanted to appear more sympathetic. This all reported by the Tacoma News Tribune. Quote, defense attorney Brian Hirschman said Hartman's father began giving him alcohol when he was still in a high chair to make him a man, and his mother got him hooked on pills before he was 10. He described Hartman's childhood as hell, detailing multiple instances of sexual assault and domestic abuse. At the time of this offense, he didn't know Tuesday from Wednesday, Hirschman said. His mental health and his addiction was so severe that he convinced himself he did not do this. He woke up at some point in the county jail with the realization that he was the one who committed this atrocious act, end quote. Several members of Michella's family delivered victims' impact statements, either reading them in court or providing them in writing to Judge Rumbaugh. Barbara Welch said, quote, my life was turned upside down on the day Michella was raped and murdered. Michella was a happy child. She was also trusting, too trusting. This is the day Hartman faces the judge. I say lock him up and throw away the key. It won't bring her back, but justice will have been served. Michella's sister Nicole said, quote, forgiveness is the only way to keep me from being infected by the continual pain. I do not wish any harm to come to him because I would be of the same spirit as him. Though our lives are linked together because of this tragedy, I do not want to be of the same mindset in harming others. Carol Brogy, a sister of Barbara's, wrote, quote, Gary Hartman is an arrogant monster. His decision to choose a bench trial versus a jury trial is a cowardly attempt to avoid publicity and remain hidden. Did he feel remorse then or now or at any time in the 35 years? I don't think so. I have a memory of the police department chaplain asking me to step outside for a minute and then being told that Michella had been found and she was dead. I can still hear myself screaming in anguish. What I don't have are memories of her going to prom, graduating high school, or getting married. My wish is to see Gary Hartman convicted and sentenced to the rest of his life in prison. I want to be assured that he will never be given an opportunity for parole. Cynthia Matthews, another of Barbara's sisters, addressed her letter to Hartman, referring to him as Mr. Heartless. She wrote, 30-some years of freedom for him, 30-some years plus a lifetime of grief and sorrow for Michella's family. Michella's aunts, uncles, cousins, classmates, friends, and a community terrorized by Mr. Hartman's evil. Betty Scarpino, another of Barbara's sisters, said, quote, 30 years is a long time to agonize over who did this to Michella and why is he still living a free life. Gary Hartman's plea of innocence heaps more hurt and pain onto our family. He obviously lacks integrity and perhaps has no soul. What kind of monster would continue to claim that he didn't murder Michella? Our family's pain and emotional trauma is still very much with us. Personally, I am not emotionally able to be in the same room with Gary Hartman. I simply cannot attend his trial or sentencing. Michella's aunt Linda McGuire wrote, her murder was the worst and most devastating event in our family. There is a hole in our lives no one can fill. Even though it took 32 years to arrest Gary Hartman, the hole is still there. We will never get Michella back, but the arrest of Gary Hartman and bringing him to trial is a sad win for our family. Hartman cried and sobbed loudly throughout this proceeding. He kept blubbering, I'm so sorry, God knows I'm so sorry, and that doesn't help, I'm just so sorry. I don't think he was sorry. I think he was sorry he got caught. Judge Rumbaugh sentenced Hartman to 26 years, 6 months in prison, essentially endorsing the agreement the prosecutors had struck with Hartman's attorney. Judge Rumbaugh said to Hartman, whatever your life has been subsequent to March 26 of 1986, it cannot erase or moderate the horror of the crime. There are no excusing conditions for your behavior. You are guilty of one of the most malignant and depraved crimes this court has ever had the opportunity to address. Suffice it to say that the maximum of 320 months in prison is what the law specifies and what the court will impose. So Hartman went to prison in 2022 and faced a 20-year sentence that everyone understood was intended to ensure he died in prison. His only hope was his appeal of the trial court's denial of his motion to suppress the DNA evidence. The Washington State Court of Appeals ruling was handed down on August 22, 2023. As we know, for a constitutional violation allegation to succeed, a defendant has to show that the government action violated the defendant's own rights rather than the rights of a third party. Summarizing the case, the appeals court wrote, "The central question raised in Hartman's brief, whether Hartman had a privacy interest in the segments of his DNA that he has in common with his relatives, giving him standing to challenge the analysis of the GEDmatch database, is an issue of first impression in Washington." End quote. This means there was no precedent in the state for the court to follow. The court noted that unlike private information requiring a warrant, quote, consumers frequently upload their DNA to consumer databases like GEDmatch for the very purpose of learning and sharing with strangers the exact private information, details about their ancestry and familial relations at issue here. All that police learned from the GEDmatch analysis was the killer's familial relations. And identifying unknown family members is the exact reason that users of consumer databases like Hartman's relatives post their genetic material on those databases. Although Washington cases express a distaste for fishing expeditions, the DNA profiles uploaded into GEDmatch were expressly available for the public to analyze, end quote. The court likened the upload of the relatives' profiles to other information posted online. Quote, "The historical treatment of information posted on the internet does not support concluding that Hartman had a privacy interest in the genetic information his relatives had in common with him that those relatives posted online." So the court ruled there is no privacy interest in commonly held DNA that a relative voluntarily uploads to a public database that openly allows law enforcement access. Absent a privacy interest, Hartman did not have standing to challenge the comparison of the crime scene DNA with the GEDmatch database. Hartman's appeals are over. Everyone hopes Hartman, who is now 72 years old, will die in prison. When the cops came for him, Hartman and his wife were living in a home in Steilacoom Lake. According to KIRO7, neighbors described him as a friendly man with a fondness for vintage cars. He had a 1964 Plymouth Fury and a 1937 pink Chevy. "We invited him in our house to have a beer," neighbor Heather Broadmonte told the station. "He seemed like this normal, cool dude." The Tacoma News-Tribune reported that neighbors described Hartman as sweet and polite. And as we heard, his wife and daughters were blindsided by his arrest for a heinous, shocking child murder. But way back when the Bastian and Welch murders happened, members of Gary's extended Hartman family were considering calling Gary in as a tip, because many family members were scared of him and felt that he was someone who could do something like that. But no one did, or if they did, there's no record of it. RJ had reason to believe his brother could be responsible. Sometime around that time frame, Gary had shown up at RJ's door around 12:30 in the morning, freaked out and shaking. He said he wanted RJ to tell people he'd been there all night. RJ's wife Barbara recalled that his excuse had been he'd been stepping out on his wife and didn't want to get caught. Neither RJ nor Barbara could remember the exact date of this event, but both said it was totally out of character. It's pretty crazy that Hartman has no prior criminal record. As we heard, he has one significant arrest which did not result in a conviction, which makes me wonder how many times that's happened in the lives of all these killers we've been talking about for 4 years on this show. When Hartman was arrested, he was working as a community nurse specialist at Western State Hospital, an 800-bed inpatient psychiatric hospital. In this capacity, he assisted discharged patients with transitioning back into the community. There are no complaints on his employment record, according to the Tacoma News-Tribune. However, his brother RJ told the detectives that he had called into Western State and reported his brother, who had told him that he enjoyed tying down and beating a nonverbal patient who had bitten him. It's kind of satisfying to hear about how Hartman was freaking out before his arrest. Police talked to a female coworker with the initials CM, who was what I would describe as Hartman's work wife. They were close coworkers and friends for 10 years. They were good enough friends that Hartman called her a couple times from jail, complaining about the food and how uncomfortable his cell was. He did not know that she had approached Detective Riopel with some information. CM told the detective that Hartman was kind of raunchy at work, talking about sex a lot with the other guys, and in front of female coworkers. She said he would bring up, quote, oral, anal, giving it to her, that kind of stuff. Hartman had bragged about how many women at the hospital he'd slept with. By the way, other female coworkers backed this up. He was always boasting about how many women he'd effed and how he used to get blowjobs all the time, blah, blah, blah. He was described as crass and vulgar by one woman he worked with closely. A male coworker said, quote, he just had no respect for women at all. CM said Hartman told her he had done some bad things when he was younger, but in his mid-30s, he decided to turn his life around. We now know he killed Michella when he was 35. CM provided some crucial information about comments Hartman had made to her sometime around June 11th or 12th of 2018. This was just about a week before he was arrested, but after Detective Riopel had grabbed his used napkins from McDonald's. It turned out the police had been tailing Hartman for several days and had actually grabbed abandoned items on 3 separate occasions. Well, Hartman apparently sensed that. The co-worker, CM, told the police, quote, I saw Gary at work. He got out of his car and came up to me. He was very pale and panic-stricken. He told me he was being followed by someone. I asked him why they would do this. He said, I did something very horrible 30 years ago, and they've tracked me down. I asked him what he did, and he said, I can't tell you, because when you find out you will hate me and be disgusted in me. Everyone will hate me. And then he looked like he was on the verge of crying. He said, I spent the last 30 years trying to make up for what I did back then. Hartman's wife, LF, interviewed by Detective Quillo outside the house she shared with him as police searched it, said, quote, he told me there was somebody following him. I told him, you're nuts. Other coworkers also noticed the shift in Hartman's demeanor. He became paranoid and obsessed with the idea that he was being followed. He started speaking in code and borrowing cell phones in case his was being monitored. He started keeping his trash from his daily McDonald's run instead of throwing it away. All the actions of a guilty man. So what was Hartman's connection to Michella? None that we know of. Hartman's name was nowhere in the massive case file, which was sent to me, 4,000 pages. He was never interviewed or even looked at. All we know is that in March 1986, Hartman was working as a driver for Hostess Cupcakes and was done with his shift by about early afternoon. At the time, he was living with his second wife, Elizabeth, in a house in the 4600 block of North Huson Street. This was less than 2 miles from Point Defiance Park. Note that someone else was also living on North Huson Street in 1986, Robert Washburn. They lived exactly 1 mile apart on the same street at the same time. The two men were 6 years apart in age, but apparently shared the same disturbing proclivities as well as a neighborhood. After getting away with literal murder for more than 30 years, they were arrested within a month of each other in 2018. Hartman did not have to confess to what he did to Michella as part of the stipulation, so we don't know if he came upon her in the gulch or he was the man seen talking to her at the picnic area. For the record, he does not have olive skin as indicated by the teacher who saw Michella talking to a man pointing toward the gulch. Remember, his phenotype indicated he had fair skin and brown or hazel eyes with darker blonde hair. Unlike Washburn, Hartman wasn't found in possession of pornography that I know of, and he didn't admit to harboring sick urges the way Washburn did. He didn't admit to much of anything, actually. Maybe his attorney was correct. Hartman was using drugs and alcohol at the time and barely knew what he was doing when he attacked Michella. Or maybe he knew exactly what he was doing. After all, the weapon she was bludgeoned with was never found, and twine was found at the scene that was clearly there for a reason. Even though Hartman claimed to his coworker to have spent the last 30 years making up for what he did, I'm not convinced he was truly regretful of his actions. And by the way, none of the people who were close to Hartman knew anything about any parasitic issues he may have had. Remember the parasitic feces found at Michella's scene. An expert parasitologist at George Washington University in Washington, D.C., told Detective Lindsay Wade it was possible that Michella's killer, now known to be Hartman, might have picked up the parasite from dog feces, possibly in the park where people walked their dogs. The parasite was unusual, was associated with poor hygiene, and was sometimes fatal. Clearly, it didn't kill Gary Hartman. Instead, he was the killer. In 2019, legislation called Jennifer and Michella's Law was passed in Washington state. This important law helped strengthen Washington's DNA law by adding additional qualifying offenses, which require submission of DNA samples upon conviction. I'll be discussing the legislation with Detective Lindsay Wade in the interview that will air right after this episode. I have to say, the resolution of Michella's case with the arrest and conviction of Gary Hartman feels especially sweet, knowing that Hartman's despicable actions on that March day in 1986 not only snuffed out Michella's innocent young life in the most brutal and horrific fashion, but also provided fodder for the fantasies of another aspiring child killer. Hartman's successful crime almost certainly gave Robert Washburn the courage to act on his own sadistic, depraved fantasies of raping and killing a child. We know that these killers learn from each other. I fully believe that Robert Washburn took inspiration from the one who went before him. His abduction and murder of Jenny Bastian is a true copycat crime, and one wonders whether he would have ever had the courage to do it had not Hartman done it first and succeeded. I was getting some small pleasure in contemplating how Washburn can now emulate Hartman for the remainder of both their miserable lives, locked up in cages with crappy food and scary fellow inmates who do not like child killers. But then I realized Washburn and Hartman are incarcerated at the same facility. They are both long-term residents of Airway Heights Correction Center in Washington state. I can't bear to think that for the next 20 years or however long these two child rapists and murderers survive, they might be comparing notes and sharing memories of the worst humanity is capable of. After 36 years, Michella Welch's case is solved thanks to forensic genealogy. And if you're one of the bad guys, they're coming for you. Now I'm bringing to you my conversation with retired Tacoma Police Detective Lindsay Wade. Detective Wade was instrumental in bringing the Jenny Bastian case to a close. Her book, called In My DNA, My Career Investigating Your Worst Nightmares, details her storied career as a detective within the framework of the Jenny Bastian case. Lindsay and I met at CrimeCon in Nashville. We were introduced by our mutual friends Bill Thomas and Kristen Dilley over at Mind Over Murder. Just to give you a heads up, Lindsay and I talked a little bit off the record before I started recording, which is why it sounds a bit like we're picking up in the middle of a conversation.
So, Lindsay, welcome to the show. So, tell me about how Jenny's and Michella's murders impacted you when I know they happened when you were a child, and they helped sort of direct your career if they did. I've obviously laid out the essential facts for the case already. Everyone's heard the 2 episodes. But I'd like to hear why Jenny's case in particular impacted you so much and why you decided to frame your book around the case.
Well, yeah, the 2 cases really were sort of like an urban legend, and sort of in the backdrop of my childhood. I grew up in a suburb of Tacoma, and I was 11 I was 10 when Michelle was killed. I was 11 when Jennifer was killed. So, and they were 12 and 13 respectively. And it really was so shocking and terrifying as a young child to hear about something like that happening to a couple of little girls that were pretty similar to me as far as age, and they were out doing what I would have been doing, on one of those days, riding a bike, going to the park. Everybody was familiar with Point Defiance Park. Everyone, spent time there in their childhood, and I used to go to day camp there when I was younger, and
Wow.
So it was very it hit close to home, and because the cases were unsolved, then it sort of deepened the mystery, and it just made it even more terrifying, especially as a kid. It really curtailed the way kids were allowed to sort of be, if that makes sense. I mean, before this, I would say that there was probably a lot of free range parenting going on, and kids were pretty free to just come back, when the street lights come on, and come home for dinner, kind of a thing, and maybe check it, once a day or whatever. And once this happened, that really changed. Kids were scared, but parents were scared too, because it was something that kind of really hit home, and it made us I know for myself and my close friends, it made us, kind of feel like, gosh, if that could happen to those girls, could that happen to us?
Sure. Yeah. Okay. So your career takes off. You obviously have had a very successful career. And when it came time to write your book, I'm just curious how you decided to sort of weave it in with Jenny's case.
Yeah. So that was, that was interesting. It was, on one hand, it was kind of difficult, but then on the other hand, it was pretty simple because my agent, who was also my editor and my publisher, was really good at sort of looking at it from the outside perspective, and helped me just sort of figure out the best way to sort of weave in the details throughout the book. But I think with Jennifer's case and also Michella's cases, I mean, they were so important to me, and they really they just kind of stuck with me. I mean, there were a few different things that happened in my childhood that probably led me down the road to wanting to be a detective. Their cases for sure. There was also an incident when I was 8 where I woke up and found a man standing at the foot of my bed, which was terrifying. And then when I was in high school reading about Ted Bundy, I mean, that just kind of, locked it in for me. And I knew at that point that I wanted to be a detective. So I think it's probably a combination of, sort of all of those different things that got me really interested in crime and in true crime and wanting to solve crimes. So, it was interesting because when I wrote the book, I went through and chose cases that really impacted me as a detective, and cases that kind of stuck with me. And, when I got done making my list of cases, of course, it turned out that all of the cases that ended up going into the book were cases involving young women or young girls,
Right.
As part of the victims. And it was interesting because even when I wasn't actively working on Jennifer and Michella's cases, even when I was a sex crimes detective, it was like, there's just certain cases that are always kind of stick with you, and they're always sort of in the back of your mind. And so you might be working on a different case, but in the back of your mind, you're thinking, hey, could this possibly be involved? Could this person be a suspect, or could this person potentially have been involved in those cases? And that's really how those cases impacted me throughout my career.
Okay. Well, you did a wonderful job in your book at really making the human element very apparent. I mean, your friendship with Patty Bastian and the sort of personal investment that you make in your cases and your work is really comes through. I've read it a couple of times now. So this tip that Washburn called in Michella's case, right? Do you think he just made that up? Like he wanted to talk to the police. He got like a tinge of excitement out of this whole thing, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that if I had to guess, I would say that when he heard about, I mean, because first of all, he lived like 10 blocks from
Right.
Hartman. I mean, they lived literally on the same street, on Northeast Street.
Yeah.
There's no evidence that they knew each other, but that was such a huge case, and it would have been so close to his house that I think he probably got excited by hearing about Michella's case.
Yeah.
Now, then it sort of begs the question, did he get so excited that he decided he was going to do something similar? And was he smart enough to think, 10 steps ahead and say, if I call in this tip about that other girl's case that I had nothing to do with, in the same park where I plan to kill a girl in a few months, will they connect the two cases and think it was the same guy? That, I don't know. I mean, that's a stretch.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
It is a stretch to think. So I don't know. I mean, I really wish he would have given an interview, because I would love to ask that question. Like, what the hell were you thinking? Now, it could very well be that he called in the tip because he wanted to just he got excited about inserting himself into that investigation, because we know that he frequented Point Defiance Park. So even without completely thinking it through or thinking through, like, I'm going to plan to kill somebody in this park at some point, that's just a long time, because that was March when he called in that tip. I think it was March.
No, it was June.
May.
I think it was like May or June. Yeah.
Yeah, May. And then he doesn't kill Jennifer until August. Now, and I have no reason to believe that, Jennifer was targeted other than that day when he saw her riding through the park. Like, I mean, could he have seen her previously? Maybe, because she did ride there frequently with her girlfriend. But I mean, I think he's your typical predator. He was looking for a victim, and, that victim presented themselves to him. He was prepared and ready to act when he found the right victim, and he did. I mean, I have no doubt that he was planning it and fantasizing about it and thinking about it for a long time before he actually did it. I do believe he has other victims out there, but, whether we'll ever be able to identify any of those cases and whether they're homicides or missing persons or sexual assaults, I don't know. But, he used a rope, she had a rope tied around her neck.
Yeah.
That, again, that screams pre-planning. The cave was sort of well prepared. So the location was pretty far off the path. It wasn't like it was like right off the side, side of the 5-mile drive. So all of these things make me think there was a lot of planning that went into it and a lot of, fantasizing about the crime beforehand. And so that all screams, of course, premeditation. I just don't think it was necessarily a premeditated victim. I think it was just the crime itself. He wanted to do it. He just didn't know who it was going to be.
So let's talk a little bit about one thing that you've talked about as your passion project, and you address in the book, obviously, which is sort of filling the holes in CODIS, right? Listeners are very aware about what CODIS is and the fact that a lot of cases I've covered, the guy wasn't in there because he was in prison and no one ever collected it because he was incarcerated before, the database was up and running, or, somehow he just never gave a sample or whatever, there's so many different reasons it slips through. So, and you realize that Ted Bundy's DNA wasn't in CODIS, which is obviously the ultimate shocker, right? So you want to just give my listeners a little bit about that?
Yeah. So, probably end of 2010, my partner and I were looking at a cold case, and it was actually the coldest case that we had in Tacoma. And it was the 1961 abduction of an 8-year-old girl named Anne Marie Burr. She was abducted from her home in the middle of the night while her whole family was at home. Everyone was asleep. And she's still missing to this day. And it wasn't until Bundy was, arrested for multiple murders and of course, years after the fact, that his name came up as a potential suspect in Anne's case, because he also was from Tacoma. Right. And he lived in technically the north end of Tacoma, but really not the same area of North Tacoma that she lived in at the time that she went missing. But regardless, because he is who he is, or was who he was, and he would have been 14 at the time that she was abducted.
Wow.
His name was always out there, and then there are lots of theories out there. There's probably, lots of books out there, talking about how she was probably his first victim. So anyway, when we got to looking at that case, we knew that Bundy was a name, a suspect in that case. But I started wondering if we actually had anything to compare to his, basically for his DNA profile. We had learned that there was evidence collected back in 1961 from Anne's case and had never been submitted to the crime lab. And so the thought was, okay, well, if we do submit these items for DNA testing, are we even going to have anything to compare it to. And so that really started me down this path of looking at, does Ted Bundy's DNA even exist anywhere in any database? And the answer was no, it did not. It didn't exist in Washington because he had no convictions in Washington. When I called down to Florida, it didn't exist there either, even though he was convicted and ultimately executed in Florida. And so I worked with the CODIS administrator in Florida, Department of Law Enforcement, and he and I just sort of, put our heads together and decided, okay, how do we find a sample for Bundy? Because, obviously he's a notorious, probably the most notorious cross-country serial killer in the United States. He's got, he's suspected of who knows how many murders in other states that are, still unsolved. So he definitely needed to be in the database. And so the medical examiner's office had tried to generate a profile, and they actually did generate an RFLP profile for Bundy back in like maybe the late 90s. But, RFLP is not compatible with CODIS. And
Right.
so, and they did not have any DNA left to work with. So that was a dead end. So the CODIS administrator let me know that there was actually a sort of like a crime museum in their crime lab, and they had the wax molds that were used or that were taken from Bundy's teeth before the Chi Omega trial. And so he attempted to get a profile from the wax molds, got a partial profile, but not enough to go into CODIS. So that was a dead end. I actually reached out to Anne Rule, who lives, or she's passed away now, but at the time she was still living here in Washington State.
Yeah.
I remembered from reading her book, The Stranger Beside Me, that Bundy had written her letters from jail and from prison. And so I got in touch with her, and she confirmed that she still had several letters from him with the stamps, the envelopes and the stamps still affixed. And so I thought, well, maybe there's a possibility that we could get his DNA from the stamps on these letters. And so I went through this whole process of researching, what the inmate mail process was in the prison system in Florida back when he was there, and, did as best as I could to confirm that it would have been him that would have had to lick these stamps and put them on the envelopes, because, they didn't have self-adhesive stamps back then. So Anne Rule gave me the letters and the envelopes, and I was planning to submit those to the crime lab to see if we could obtain any DNA from these stamps. But before I had the opportunity to do that, I got a call from Florida letting me know that the CODIS administrator was able to actually track down a blood vial of Bundy's blood that was collected back in 1978. He was arrested.
Wow.
And this vial had been sitting in a safe in a clerk's office at room temperature in Florida since 1978. So you can imagine what the state of this blood vial was. The blood itself was pretty much unusable and completely putrefied. However, there was some dried blood on the lid of the container, and they were able to just scrape off a few flakes of the dried blood.
Okay.
And a full profile. So Bundy's profile was entered into Florida's database, and that's where it was going to stay initially, because he didn't actually, apparently, based on the way their law was written, he didn't qualify for the national database. And so it was like, well, okay, being in the Florida database is good, but that's not all that helpful given the fact that he's got all these other crimes that he's suspected of all over the country. And so after 3 more months of meetings that the Florida CODIS administrator had with the FBI, they finally agreed that he could go into the legal index of NDIS, which is the National DNA Database. So his profile is there since 2012. No hits so far that I'm aware of. But that really was my first introduction to this issue. And since then, it's really heightened my awareness. And so I'm always paying attention to news articles when I see these cold cases being solved. And I've just come up with really example after example after example of these really horrific serial offenders who are not in the database.
Right.
And kind of makes sense in a way, because when you think about it, the 70s and 80s, that was really like the golden age of serial killing. Well, that was pre-CODIS. That was pre-DNA. That was pre-DNA database. So a lot of these guys, they are either in prison still today and are never going to get out. They've died in prison, or maybe they were executed. Well, all three of those are like really, I would say low priority levels for collecting DNA. From the state perspective, because they're not getting out, they're not going to harm anybody else, right? A lot of these correctional institutions have policies that say they collect DNA on the way out instead of on the way in. Well, if they were already in before their DNA law went into effect, they're essentially forgotten about. There are some states that, say that they cannot retroactively collect DNA from inmates who were incarcerated prior to the DNA law taking effect. So there's lots of different loopholes. And then if the offender's dead, and let's say they were convicted before the DNA law took effect, there's a very good likelihood that they don't qualify to go into the DNA database.
Right. Wow. That is insane. So your book spells out in great detail how you worked to overcome those odds and to fix holes in the problem was there's different legislation, like you said, in every state, right? So every state's database has some requirements that may be more stringent or less stringent than the national database requirements. And so there's all sorts of disparities and discrepancies. So
right.
You and Patty worked together on getting this, it's called Jenny and Michella's law, passed in Washington. So at least your home state has what you consider hopefully a satisfactory DNA collection law. And would you want to just give us a little bit on what you did with that? And do you think that DNA should be collected upon felony arrest?
To answer your question, yes, I believe that everyone's DNA should be collected upon felony arrest. Unfortunately, not all states do that yet, and Washington does not do that. But I think that would solve a lot more crime, and it would prevent crime from occurring. But so yes, Jennifer's mom and I worked for about 4 years, going down to the state capitol and testifying in front of various legislative committees to try and get this law passed. And finally, in 2019, it was successful. And it's not perfect, but it does strengthen Washington's DNA collection law, especially with regard to deceased offenders. And so the law allows for law enforcement to basically submit DNA samples from convicted offenders who are deceased, regardless of the conviction date, to the forensic DNA laboratory for upload to CODIS.
Oh,
and
that is.
It's huge because, you've got all these offenders that died, in the 70s and 80s, 90s that were never collected, but they're convicted of rape and murder, and all these violent crimes. They're responsible for the cold cases that were happening during that time frame, and they're largely unaccounted for in the DNA databases. So it's been huge, and we've had one success already in Washington as a result of that law being passed. So I was able to obtain a sample from a deceased offender who was executed in 1994. He was executed for committing a triple homicide of 2 women and an 8-year-old girl, and actually a revenge murder that he committed. The victim, one of the victims, was actually a previous sexual assault victim who testified against him, and so when he got out of prison, he went back and murdered her daughter, and her neighbor who testified against him. So he was ultimately executed in 94, no DNA in CODIS. He was sort of my poster child when I would go down to Olympia to explain why we needed this law change. And I would say, he needs to be in CODIS. So fast forward to 2019, the law passes, I was able to get a sample of his DNA from the medical examiner that was a part of his autopsy and submit that to the crime lab. And then 3 years later, I get a phone call from a cold case detective in Seattle letting me know that he just got a hit to a 1975 unsolved homicide of a graduate student at the University of Washington.
Wow.
Hit to this offender.
Which that never would have been solved.
Yeah. That case wouldn't have been solved with IgG. There was no DNA left to do IgG. Everything had been consumed doing the STR testing in 2001, I think.
Okay.
So there was nothing left.
That must have felt really, really good.
It did, and it felt great, but it was also just like, okay, we're on the right track here. Like this is, this makes sense. I was
This
just
needs to happen. Yeah.
And don't get me wrong, I love genetic genealogy. I think it's great, but sometimes we need to step back and go back to the basics. And the reality is that, CODIS gets, I don't even know what the stats are. I wish I would have written it down because I was just at a training and I heard the stats of how many CODIS hits are issued, every 2 days. Basically, it's the same number that have been, every 2 days, CODIS produces investigative leads in the form of hits. And it's something like, over 500, every 2 days for all areas. Whereas, how many cases have been solved with IgG in 5 years?
Like 600. Yeah.
So, we can't forget about CODIS because, it's there for a reason. And it's obviously much less expensive than doing IgG if you don't have any evidence left, which is very common in some of these older cases, especially where everything was consumed. Who's not in CODIS? That's what, cold case investigators need to be asking those questions. Like in your state, everybody's got those well-known serial offenders that died in prison. Who are they? And are they in CODIS?
What are your thoughts then on, speaking of CODIS and state databases, on the use of familial DNA and the fact that it's not used in more than, I think it's 13 or 14 states now do it. So I don't believe Washington is one of them. What are your thoughts on that and whether we should be, I'm surprised that more states aren't willing to embrace that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm all for using every tool in the toolbox, right? Like familial is not going to solve every case. CODIS isn't going to solve every case. IgG isn't going to solve every case, but increase your odds of being able to solve a case by having every tool available to you. So I would love to see, all states embracing the use of familial DNA testing. It is expensive.
Yeah.
It can be just as expensive or potentially more expensive than even IgG. So, I think that's a hindrance and, but it's something that can be overcome.
Yeah. I mean, Florida, it's required before IgG that they do it, and it's solved quite a few cases. I'm working on one right now. So, okay, 2 more questions and I'll let you go. Will you give us an idea of what you're doing now? If I understand correctly, you're at the Attorney General's office. And are you still there?
No, I actually, so I work for a nonprofit now, and I basically act as sort of a subject matter expert to law enforcement agencies around the country.
Oh, great. What's the name of the agency?
So I don't think I can say. I have to get, prior permission.
Okay.
If someone were to look me up online, I'm sure they could figure it out. But yeah, so I do that, and then I'm working on another book at the moment, and working on a podcast concept as well. So related to missing DNA samples and CODIS.
Oh, wow. Oh my gosh, that's so exciting. Okay, well, good. First of all, you won't be competing with me on my IgG podcast. That's good. And you ruined my last question, which was, are there any more books in your future? So it sounds like yes.
Yeah.
Can you give us anything about it?
Yeah. So this, the one I'm working on currently is actually True Crime and Cocktails. And so it is going to be a book that contains a bunch of different cocktails with fun names, and they will be either inspired by or paired with true crime books and true crime podcasts.
Wow, fun. Okay. Well,
Yeah.
I'll try to think of a cocktail name using DNA ID. I don't know.
Yeah. Tell me what your favorite favorite cocktail is, and I'll see if I can pair it with.
Okay, well, I can tell you that right now. It's a spicy margarita.
Oh, okay. Perfect.
So yeah, we'll stew on that for a while. Okay, well, I will tell everyone about your book. I will also link to the book on our show notes and our website, etc. So everyone can read it. I highly, highly recommend it. It's called In My DNA, My Career Investigating Your Worst Nightmares. And it is not for the faint of heart. Don't, read it if you're home alone.
Yeah. My 14-year-old has asked to read it, and I said, absolutely not. So.
Absolutely not. No. She's going to have to be 35 before she can read that.
Exactly.
All right, Lindsay. Well, thank you so much. This has been amazing. I'm glad we got the Zoom to work out. I'm sorry I'm technologically sort of incompetent. And I will let you know when this comes out so you can listen.
Great. Sounds good.
Great. Awesome. Have a great rest of your summer.
Thanks. You too.
Okay. Thanks.
Recently, I let listeners know about a new benefit available to them called an AbJack Insider subscription that's available through Apple Podcasts. An AbJack Insider subscription will give listeners ad-free access to every bit of DNA ID content published, both past episodes and future episodes. It will also give you benefits like early access and bonus content. Head over to Apple Podcasts and click on the DNA ID show page or the AbJack Entertainment channel to start a free trial. Thanks for listening to this episode of DNA ID. If you'd like to listen to the show ad-free and help support the show in the process, please head over to patreon.com/DNAID. And if you're interested in some fun DNA ID merch, visit the store at customizedgirl.com/s/DNAID podcast. To contact the show, please email us at dnaidpodcast@gmail.com. Follow us on social media at DNAID Podcast on Instagram, at DNAID Podcast on Twitter, or on Facebook at facebook.com/DNAID Podcast. Finally, if you want to visit our website, go to DNAIDpodcast.com. You'll be able to get all the episodes of the show, leave comments on episodes that I can respond to, and you can even leave voicemails. You'll get all the latest news about the show and important updates. Find links to our social media, merch, and a lot more. It's really your one-stop shop for everything DNA ID. DNA ID is written, researched, and hosted by me, Jessica Betancourt. It's produced by me and Mike Morford of AbJack Entertainment. Music by Connor Betancourt. Check out our other collaborative podcasts, Scene of the Crime, Missing Persons, and Beyond Bizarre True Crime.